Very cheerful morning to all my dear students. Welcome back to online classes. I hope you enjoyed the break and successfully scored good marks in your midterm examination. I want to congratulate you all for completing the first term, especially through online classes. Now let's start the second term with the same refreshment and enthusiasm. So take out your English literature book. Today we will start chapter 16, An Excellent Father. I'm giving you 2 minutes. Please take out your English literature book and open page number 115. So, as I told you, the name of the chapter is An Excellent Father. This story is an extract from the famous novel Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen. Main characters in this story are Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Bingley, Mrs. Long, Lizzie. Lizzie was the nickname of Elizabeth, and Kitty was the nickname of Catherine. So, this is the story of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. They were having 5 daughters, but in this story given in your book, it is not mentioned. But Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, they have 5 daughters, and Mrs. Bennet, especially, she was worried about the marriage of her daughters, and she was in a search of suitable match for her daughters, and all the time she was curious and eagerly searching for a suitable match for her daughters. Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bingley is a handsome, unmarried young man of large fortune. Large fortune fortune means wealth. He is very rich and wealthy, for whom Mrs. Bennet was looking for. So Mr. Bingley was the Yes, Mr. Bingley was the groom. That Mr. and Mrs. Bennet was looking for her daughters. Mrs. Long is the neighbor of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Lizzie and Kitty both were the daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Lizzie, as I told you, is the nickname of Elizabeth, and Kitty was the nickname of Catherine. So let's start and see what happened in the story. As the name of the chapter is An Excellent Father, which is, I told you, an extract from the famous novel Pride and Prejudice. Students, you might have seen the movie Bride and Prejudice. Yes, this is the movie is based on this novel Pride and Prejudice. In this movie Bride and Prejudice, Aishwarya Rai played a real lead role in this movie. So from this I hope you remember and interestingly read the story. This novel is used in many films, shows, Hindi shows, English movies, and Hindi movies and Hindi shows. Right, as I told you, Bride and Prejudice is the famous movie which is based on this novel Pride and Prejudice. In that movie, Aishwarya Rai played a lead role. Okay. So let's start. So you can see here Mr. and Mrs. Bennet both were sitting here and they both had a conversation. Let's see what happened. My dear Mr. Bennet, said Mrs. Bennet one day, have you heard that Netherfield park is let at last. Now, what do you mean by let? Let means that something had been given on rent. Netherfield Park is a residential place that has been given on rent, right? So, Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, they had a conversation regarding Netherfield Park, and Mrs. Bennet was informing Mr. Bennet that Netherfield Park had been rented to somebody, and that was an expensive place, and that was taken up by a young man, a young rich man, for which she was looking for. Right? So let's see what happened. Mr. Bennet replied that he had not heard about it. But it is, said she, for Mrs. Long has just been here and she told me all about it. Mr. Bennet made no answer. As Mr. Bennet was not interested, he just gave a simple answer that he had not heard about it. So Mrs. Bennet said, Mrs. Long, as I told you in the introduction, Mrs. Long was the neighbor of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and Mrs. Long informed Mrs. Bennet regarding the Netherfield Park and regarding the young rich man who had just entered their town to live in this palace. Do you know? Do you want to know who has taken it? Cried his wife impatiently. You want to tell me? And I have no objection to hearing it. As I told you, Mr. Bennet was not interested. Simply, he gave simple answer that yes, he had not heard about it. So, listening to him, Mrs. Bennet informed Mr. Bennet that do you want to know who has taken that Netherfield Park, who had come there to stay? Mr. Bennet said, you want to tell me? I am hearing. Right, I have no objection to hear you. This was invitation enough. Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from north of England. Means Netherfield Park is taken by young rich man of large fortune, that he is a very rich man, and he belongs from England. He came on Monday to see the place and was so much delighted with it that he agreed to take it. So she said that the young man was delighted to see the place and he was agreed to take it. What is his name? Bingley. Is he married or single? Oh, single, my dear, to be sure, a single man of large fortune, 4 or 5 thousand a year. What a fine thing for our girls. So Mr. Bennet, after listening that a young rich man had came to stay in the Netherfield Park, he asked his name. His name was Mr. Bingley. Mrs. Bennet replied that his name was Mr. Bingley. Then the next question asked by Mr. Bennet was that is he married or single? Listening to him, Mrs. Bennet said, of course he is single and he earned 4 or 5 thousand pounds a year. Right, what a fine thing for our girls. So, in short, she was ready to marry one of her daughter with Mr. Bingley. She was interested as she was in search of a suitable match for her daughters. So, how, my dear, Mr. Bennet replied his wife, how can you be so tiresome? Tiresome means boring. Mrs. Bennet said when Mr. Bennet asked her that how you think he is a good and suitable match for our daughters. Listening to him, Mrs. Bennet said, how can you be so boring? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. How can you be so boring when you know I am interested and I found him a suitable match for one of our daughters? So, how can you ask this stupid questions? Is that his design in settling here? Mr. Bennet said, do you think, is he going to stay here? Is he going to settle down here? Design means plan. What do you know about his plan? That is he going to settle down here? Design? Nonsense. How can you talk so? This is replied by Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet said, nonsense. How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. In short, Mrs. Bennet wanted her husband, or in short, she insisted her husband to visit Mr. Bingley and become familiar with him so that he may fall in love with one of her daughters and what as she was looking for a bright future of her daughters. Listening to her, Mr. Bennet replied, I see no occasion for that. I see no occasion for that means here Mrs. Bennet, when she insisted Mr. Bennet to visit Mr. Bingley and became familiar with him, Mr. Bennet replied, I found no occasion, I found no purpose for meeting him. You and the girls may go, or you may send them. He gave an option to Mrs. Bennet that you and the girls may go and meet Mr. Bingley, or you can send the girls, right? Which perhaps will be still better, which you may feel better, which you may think is good for Mr. Bingley, or Mr. Bingley is good for our one of our daughter, you which you think is suitable, you may send one of them, as you are as handsome as any of them. Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to marrying whichever he chooses of the girls. So, what happened? Mrs. Bingley insisted her husband to go and meet Mr. Bingley and became familiar with him, as she wanted her one of the daughter to get married with Mr. Bingley. But Mr. Bennet, he said that there is no purpose to go and meet him. Rather than he gave option to Mrs. Bennet that either she and her daughters would go and meet Mr. Bingley, or she should send daughters. She should send her daughters to go and meet Mr. Bingley. Listening to him, Mrs. Bennet replied that I want you, Mr. Bennet, please you go and meet Mr. Bingley first so that he may become familiar with you. But Mr. Bennet gave another option to Mrs. Bennet, that Mr. Bingley will be glad to see you if you go and meet him. And rather, in addition, he said that I will send a slip in which I will assure my hearty consent to choose any one of my daughter for him. Mrs. Bennet, she got irritated as Mr. Bennet was not ready to go and meet Mr. Bingley. Listening to him, she said, "You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves." Vexing means troubling, okay, to create problem or to irritate somebody. So what she and delight means happy. So she, when Mr. Bennet was not listening to Mrs. Bennet, she said, "You take delight, you feel happy when you trouble me. You have no feelings for my poor nerves. As you know, I am worried for the marriage of our daughters. You have no feeling, you have no emotions, that I am so much concerned and I am so much worried. You are not at all considering it. Rather, you are troubling me by saying all this." Listening to her, Mr. Bennet replied, "You mistake me, my dear. I have a respect for your nerves. They are my old friends." Now, as he was in a funny mood, he gave funny answers to Mrs. Bennet. What did he reply? That, "No, dear, you are mistaken me. I have a respect for your nerves. They are my old friends." Now, here Mrs. Bennet again said, "Ah, you don't know what I suffer. You don't know what I suffer here means you don't know my feelings, how much I was worried, how much I am worried for the marriage of our daughters. I want Mr. Bingley to fall in love with one of our daughters so that be it will be good for our one of the daughters, and it is good for their future also. But I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year came and come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them." Now, Mrs. Bennet at last got irritated and she said, what she said, that it will be no use to us if 20 such Mr. Bingley come and stay into our neighborhood. You will not go and visit to meet. Why? Because you are not concerned about the future of our daughters. So at last she get disappointed that Mr. Bennet was not listening to her regarding why, regarding as Mrs. Bennet wanted him to go and meet Mr. Bingley as soon as possible. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. Now, on the other hand, if we see the second face of the coin, Mr. Bingley, who was pretending that he was not interested in meeting Mr. Bingley, what we are reading now is he was too curious to meet Mr. Bingley, but he was not showing all this in front of his wife. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. Right, he had always intended to visit him. Intended means he was determined to visit him, though to the last, always assuring his wife that he should not go. In what You understand from these lines that he was also determined to meet Mr. Bingley for the bright future of his daughters but he did not show in front of his wife. Rather, he is pretending that he will not go. Why? Do you have any reason? Yes, he was also a father. He was also concerned. He was also worried for the bright future of his daughter. He is not showing all these feelings in front of his wife. Till the evening after the visit was paid, she had no knowledge of it. Mr. Bennet already met Mr. Bingley, but till the evening his wife had no knowledge of it because Mr. Bennet didn't disclose that he had already met Mr. Bingley regarding regarding their daughters. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Now, in the next scene, it was disclosed that Mr. Bennet already met Mr. Bingley regarding the marriage of his daughter. That we will continue in the next class. I hope up till now the story is clear to you. I request you to please read the story again, page number 115 and 116, and do the word meanings and question answers in your fair notebook. Till then, take care, stay safe, stay healthy. Bye bye.